Hello and welcome to TRIGGERnometry. I'm Francis Foster.
I'm Konstantin Kisin.
And this is a show for you if you want honest conversations with fascinating people.
Our brilliant and returning guest this week is Mike Driver. You may remember we did an interview with him some time ago. He's a serial entrepreneur, all-round good guy, and someone who has a lot of very counterintuitive ideas. So Mike Driver, welcome back to TRIGGERnometry.
I'm delighted to be back. Thanks for having me again. It can't have been too bad the first time.
No, it was great. It was great the first time, and it's good to have you back. One of the reasons we wanted to have you back, actually, is you and I were chatting on the phone the other day, and you were just talking about the situation that we're in now with the lockdown, the government's response to it, and you were saying there's lots of things that we could be doing that we're not doing. There's lots of things that we are doing that we ought not to be doing. So what is your kind of outsider take on everything? What stands out for you in the current situation?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of good news, some of the stats that are coming through at the moment, things are starting to get better. The rate of infection and the rate of fatality, as horrible as it is does seem to be starting to decline around the world. So I think it's perhaps less bad than it was. That's a ringing endorsement of the current situation, isn't it? So I guess. We're in lockdown, and the debate about that is largely irrelevant. I think we are where we are. I guess.
But do you think it was the right decision to go into lockdown?
I mean, I'm glad I didn't have to make it. I think. Right. I think as the captain on the bridge, it's very easy for commentators to criticise when they don't have the responsibility for the consequences of their actions. I think as the captain on the bridge, you all kinds of conflicting information coming through, dynamic, moving situation, different statistics, different expert opinions, and really it's very, very difficult. And you've got to live with the consequences of your decisions. And I think very much that's the difference between, I think we had the sort of panic brigade, didn't we? Shut down, close borders. Well, I think, my first point, I guess, is that panic tends to breed chaos and calm breeds calm. So I wasn't so keen perhaps on some of the more, those people who came along and sort of screamed, but we didn't really consider the consequences of what we were doing. And I think in some ways we're still paying for not having thought through the consequences of a lockdown. Whether or not you agree with the lockdown or you don't agree with the lockdown, the consequences seem to be, or not to have been thought through as well as they might have been.
Yeah, and you've talked about the consequences of the lockdown, and we've just seen, I think it's literally today, Virgin Atlantic Australia have gone into administration. We're talking about Primark looking as if they're in real difficulties. Is this going to precipitate the end of the high street as we know it? Because the high street was already struggling, and now this has just been a further body blow to them.
Well, I think you have to look at sort of each business in its own on its own previous performance. I mean, if you take Virgin, for example, I mean, it's heavily in debt. The latest accounts, or the last published accounts, it's heavily in debt in the first place. It leases all its aeroplanes. It basically survives as a business. It runs its business out of advanced ticket sales. COVID was probably a convenient problem for Mr. Branson. I think he was in trouble anyway. So that kind of leads into some of the things I think that we're getting wrong, or that we need to really think about what we're doing in terms of the way we are supporting businesses. Because there's a very good argument to say, well, if that business was in trouble in the first place, which it was hanging on. Is it the obligation of the government to prop it up? I mean, I see he's put his island up as collateral. I mean, that's a liability. How much does it cost to run it? It's a tourist destination probably costs a couple of million to run it. You've got to admire the chutzpah, haven't you? When he says, "Oh, okay, well, I'll let you take the cost of my island as collateral because there won't be any tourists visiting it for a while. So in that respect, I think there's some businesses that are naturally or were naturally going to fail, and the danger, of course, is bailing those businesses out without obtaining equity for the taxpayer.
So what you're really, I think, saying is we shouldn't be bailing out businesses that were about to fail anyway, and COVID's just pushed them over the edge.
Well, I mean, I don't think necessarily we shouldn't bail them out, because there are other considerations to the economy for, I think that leaves one airline in Australia, for instance, or, which is a whole different problem.
Yeah, but Australia's great, mate. Who wants to leave? It's brilliant.
Well, you're not allowed to go from one state to another anyway at the moment, so they don't really need an airline. They only need one airline.
Just stay home, save lives, enjoy the good weather, have a barbie. Come on, mate.
But I guess you've got to think about the jobs. So it's not necessarily it's difficult without sort of looking in context to decide whether or not we should save this business or that business. But we should certainly be considering what sort of state was the business in before, and therefore what kind of a deal can we as the taxpayers get for whatever we decide to do in order to maintain that business trading.
And isn't it, I mean, you would know far more about this, obviously, Mike, because you're an entrepreneur, but isn't it the state of a small business that you survive month to month, really? A lot of businesses depend purely on their cash flow. And if that suddenly dries up, then after a couple of weeks, you're in serious problems, aren't you?
Well, I think some do, but I actually think and certainly cash is king. The only thing you really need to worry about in most businesses up to significant turnovers is cash flow. Cash flow will make or break your business. I absolutely agree with that. I don't think that once you get past a certain level that the majority of businesses live hand to mouth. I actually think we've got a slightly different dynamic going on. And I think this exposes one of the big issues in the government's response to the crisis with the COVID business interruption loan. I don't think I got that right. COVID business interruption loan scheme, which is delivered in the form of a loan to entrepreneurial businesses, and I think that's a major issue. And I think it continues what we've seen, which I would describe as a breaking, almost a shattering of the covenant between some citizens and society. And I think that started with student debt. So it's a little bit like, I always think with student debt, it's a little bit like the Catholic original sin. If you want to go to, you're not born with sin, you're born with original debt. If you want to educate yourself. And similarly, if you think about what entrepreneurs do in the economy and the way they actually do work, is entrepreneurs will run their businesses with an element of redundancy in it. They're looking to survive, and they will only take debt on for investment in productive equipment or people in order to generate a return. And what we're asking entrepreneurs to do now is to take debt on for survival. Well, that changes the whole raison d'etre of entrepreneurialism. And what it actually has, I think, quite severe repercussions going into the rest of the economy. So I think entrepreneurial people are the shock absorbers for the economy. And that's what this redundancy is. Entrepreneurially run businesses tend not to carry debt. In most instances, they tend to carry very manageable debt, and they tend to be able to survive normal shit. Unfortunately, nobody can survive the deluge of shit that we've got now, but they tend to be able to survive that normal day to day. Well, what entrepreneur says, and I think I said this previously, is they say, I don't know what shit's coming down the road, but I know it's coming, so I'll have some redundancy in my business. I won't be too leveraged. I'll have some cash in the bank, and I'll be able to survive those unexpected and yet moderately shit events. But what the government is suggesting is effectively the exchange of that redundancy for debt, which changes the way entrepreneurs behave, but it also takes away that shock absorber which protects millions of employees in the country from medium level shit. So when we get the other side of this, and I have to say, if we ever if they ever facilitate these loans into the businesses, which seems to be another issue for the government at the moment. I think I've kind of been through three of those sort of authors that everyone quotes as to which three books or authors, if you like, of what mess are we in? Is it Brave New World? Is it COVID 1984? But I'm actually starting to think we might be in Kafka. So we've got this sort of bureaucratic labyrinthine nightmare where businesses have, you're basically Joseph K. trying to work out how you can obtain this money. And I heard recently, this is Kafkaesque if there ever was one, that one of the things that's prevented people getting access to the loans was European regulation. We've left the EU. What is going on? You just end up going round around this labyrinth, and then you die and you don't know how it happened. So this is one of those consequences of the lockdown. Businesses did not, government shut the economy down, businesses didn't shut the economy down. So for me, a much better way to support the entrepreneurial world as opposed to the corporate world is helicopter money. So it's direct grants. What loans are going to do is they're going to fragilize a very, very important part of the economy for many years to come, and also completely change the bargain, if you like, between society and business owners. Business owners that they have to make the payroll, they have to do your job, plus all the stress of looking after you doing your job, making payroll and doing all of the things that business owners have to do. And now what we do is we add another layer of uncertainty and fragility into their businesses. And I think this is the terrible mistake.
Mike, and speaking of changing the social contract and the social dynamics and dynamics more generally, do you think that one of the changes that will happen as a result of everything we're dealing with now is a whole set of transformations, some of which are entirely unpredictable at this point? But, that up until now, and probably it's got worse now, there was the fact that, half of people in America, I think, couldn't absorb an extra cost over $400, right? So half of the country essentially living with no savings whatsoever. A lot of the same kind of patterns in businesses where there was very little resilience, particularly, as you make the distinction between corporate and entrepreneurial. We've been living very much as if the good times will last forever. And winter has come, So what do you see as going to be the big transformations that happen out of this in the way that we live our lives?
Well, I actually think there will be what looks like a fairly rapid recovery, but in terms of if you think of markets, for instance, I think it'll look because most of the money, most of the stimulus, if you like, is being funneled to the corporate sector, and I think you're going to have post the lockdowns, and once we start to unwind the lockdowns, I think you'll have that initial rush of deferred spending that people haven't done for the last few weeks or few months. I think you're going to have a little bit of that carpe diem, where people perhaps have been somewhat restricted, and I guess the potential for this ever happening again might fuel that. But I think what you're going to have that's going to make the biggest difference to people's lives is I'm not an economist, or I certainly deny all economic background, but it's something is monetized debt spending. So that's essentially where governments spend more in the economy than they remove from it in taxation. And that spending is funded by either direct funding from a central bank or the central bank buying more government treasuries. So this is I think we've spoken about it before, this is the political victory of modern monetary theory. So MMT. So this MMT is permanent government deficit spending up until the point that it causes inflation. So I think that's like crack to politicians, because it basically means a politician can promise anything without They used to promise things and not deliver them. Now they can promise things and not worry about how much they cost. So whether or not, whichever side of the argument you might fall economically on MMT, I think the argument's been lost, and the politicians have run away with that. So that's got some interesting implications. I think in the short term, pragmatically, we have to embrace it, because without it, we would end up in sort of a 1930s style depression. What happens after that, I think, is definitely going to be interesting, because my view is that when governments have no discipline, they get less value for money for their spending. That's a really nice way of saying people start to rip them off. And what MMT needs is it doesn't need any wastage in the economy. And I think anybody who's ever operated in an economy knows that when there's free money around, deception is Darwinian. Humans will find a way in an incredible amount of ways to. So I think what you then, that's essentially, in economic terms, they call that a debasement of money. So I think you will see initial, and who knows this goes on, how long this goes on for, but certainly some initial economic growth after all this is over, fueled by government deficit spending, fueled by this carpe diem and perhaps this deferred spending. But I think that once you take that discipline away from government, we might have some interesting times.
Well, just before Francis, I'm sure he's got a question for you. Just to put it into simple language for people who may not be economists, just to translate what you've said. What you're really saying is the government is going to create, i.e. print, endless loads of money, and then a lot of that is going to be wasted and stolen, and we're going to be creating growth by printing money. So when you talk about the interesting times, I mean, that is one of my kind of looming foreboding senses at this point, is that I'm having a great time, as we've discussed many times before.
Yeah.
But there will be hell to pay at some point down the line for all of us. And I just don't see how there won't.
Well, I mean, there's some interesting dynamics going on at the moment that might protect us for a bit longer. So you do have quite a lot of deflationary or disinflation pressure in the economy at the moment. So while that's going on, currently, you're going to be able to get away with this this type of spending. You know, I mean, obviously at the moment the oil price went negative yesterday, basically on the basis that a load of people didn't realize if they took delivery, they would actually have to store it somewhere. And
the oil is actually a real thing, not a thing on the screen. Yeah.
So I think when you've got those kind of pressures in the economy, and again, you'll have people better qualified than me in this particular area. At the moment, as I said, pragmatically, we have no choice. To avoid a 1930 style depression, we have to do this. I think that in that sense, the fact that we do have a lot of deflationary pressures at the moment in, the central banks think they controlled inflation by using interest rates over the last few years. That is bullshit. It basically offshoring everything to China and reducing the price of everything, or subsidizing the price of your taxi rides by Uber. I long thought that ceasing quantitative easing would lead to inflation, because everything would have to be priced normally. But I think going off subject there, I think that we do have a window to perform these type of operations. Where I think we've got a problem is that it's crack. The politicians never be able to let it go, because politicians want to promise things to voters in order for voters to. I mean, I think. Am I going to say this out loud in somewhere I can never delete? I think it's very possible that Trump will cancel student debt in America.
Really?
Because, well, he'll do anything to get the second term. If the polls aren't where he wants them to be, why not? We're writing checks for everything else. He's writing checks for the oil patch today. Airline industry yesterday. Why not? Who knows? But I think that the scope it's almost like left or right doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
The scope to curry favour means that we are now in a MMT world. Yeah.
And to quote Top Gun, and I never thought I'd do it on this podcast, but I'm going to, is Donald Trump...
come on, that's why you've got the
yeah, exactly.
They're not actually doing anything, though, are they?
Yeah, no, they're not. I just do it because it makes me think like I'm a fighter pilot. But is therefore, what you're saying is that politicians are writing checks their body can't cash, basically.
Well, it's actually, if you think about it, it goes back to the consequences argument. Trump's only got a 4-year term after this election. Will he bear the consequences of the, whatever the denouement, to steal a French phrase? It's about the only French word I know. Don't ask me what it means, but it sounds good. Of it is, he's probably not going to be around. He's certainly not going to be, or unlikely to be, president when it happens. So I think that's actually one of the big issues here, is the consequences of this won't be borne by the people who make the decision.
So you're saying that essentially it's a short-termism that we're sort of breeding now.
Well, we're giving people whose raison d'etre to be alive is power a lever to get themselves power. I don't think they think past that. No. I don't think it's whether they're short-term, long-term, or medium-term. They just want the power. The means justify the ends.
I think you're being very unfair. Jeremy Corbyn is a saint and would have done wonders. But anyway.
Mike, well, since we are in the political realm now, you and I were chatting about the fact that, the journalists haven't covered themselves in glory during this time. And you were saying you felt like, Dominic Cummings and the team behind Number 10 had played it very cleverly, to the point even where, young members of your family were starting to feel sorry for Boris Johnson. Well,
don't you think it's the most amazing thing that most people are sat at home and they're looking at the TV and every night at 4:30 or whenever the update show is, and they're turning to each other on their sofas and they're saying, why are these nasty journalists being horrible to these nice politicians? How has this happened? And I mean, I presume it's Cummings. It could be anybody, I guess. But they set the trap, didn't they? They've been like ultra considerate, polite, and at the same time, and I think this goes back to what I was saying before about how easy it is to be critical when you're not responsible for the consequences of action. And I think that's really the thing that people have sat on the sofas, and anybody who has to make decisions, and everybody has to make key decisions in their lives where they balance pros and cons, where there are conflicting interests, compromises, where they make sacrifices, and they know that nothing is black and white. And yet we seem to have the press who everything is a gotcha, or everything is seen in black and white terms. And I think people just have found that very difficult. And yet, I mean, when my 17-year-old daughter says Boris Johnson is cute, the press are getting it wrong, don't you?
Wow. And Mike, we're talking about public perception here and public perception of Boris Johnson. I want to move a little bit towards China. Has this fundamentally changed the way we perceive China, the way we perceive cheap goods that they're producing? Or do you think once we get back to normality, it'll be business as normal?
Well, I mean, globalization has been, I'd say, probably the most important force in our lives. And I mean, there's the arguments at the moment, certainly around medical, around protective equipment, and so on and so forth. And could we see some of this onshoring back into the UK or the Western countries? My gut feeling is not that we have tremendously short memories. Money talks. It's a big subject when you think about what we actually lost because we lost a lot more than the ability to produce medicines, and we lost a lot more than the ability to produce protective equipment, just to take those two examples. Those two jobs were jobs that people had a tremendous amount of pride in. So while economically you may say, well, you earn the same money in a call center as you earned producing antibiotics. Well, actually, when I went to my factory and produced antibiotics and I came home in the evening, I felt good about what I contributed to society. And perhaps there was much more for me as the employee in what I did than the actual pay. And maybe I'd go to a factory making antibiotics and be happy to earn less than I would in the new economy, whatever that is. So I think we lost a lot more, and it would be great if we did see some of those activities coming back. It would potentially be inflationary, I guess. So to go with the monetized spending, debt expenditure that the governments were doing, we'd have another inflationary contributor to the economy. My suspicion is I'm not sure. I think we'll see how much they want to get into it with China on this, I think.
Because surely the US, in particular Trump, who's notoriously skeptical about China, won't he see this as an opportunity to actually really attack them and try and make some wholesale changes to the trade deal that they have?
I think he will want to look like he is. But that's different to actually changing the terms of trade, if you like. And I think that the corporates that we're talking about before, the corporates that I think are going to do very well from this recovery, I think they will resist that. I mean, Apple's supply chain is a good case in point, isn't it? How do you, reshore Foxconn into the US? How do you tell people that their iPhone that cost $1,100 now costs $2,000? I think these are very, very difficult things to imagine happening in any more than a superficial way. Maybe for some things around sort of critical supplies, I think that it's possible, but I don't see it happening on a large scale.
I think it also depends a lot on what happens and what we find out about how the virus started and how it was spread. So if it, there's a lot of talk now that this may have escaped from a lab in Wuhan, and there's a lot of talk about China suppressing information from getting out in order to hoard ventilators and PPE, right? They were not allowing American companies that make PPE to export that PPE in January and February before we were all aware of it. So how we respond to China, I think, will depend to a large extent on what the public perception is about, is China a good faith actor or not? And I think increasingly we're starting to see that they're not. And, when we talk about antibiotics and stuff, I mean, that is an issue of national security, really, at its core. Right. If one country can switch off your supplies of antibiotics and PPE and whatever else, that's a problem. That's a problem.
It is, but I wonder how significant it is, even if that did come back in some shape or form, how significant it would be. And I guess going back to the start of your point there, Konstantin, is there is an implicit assumption in there that we ever know what the truth is, that we ever get to the truth. I mean, that seems to be one of the characteristics of the world we live in at the moment is there's just too much information.
Yeah.
And so how do you ever know which the true or what the true information is? I agree that it should happen. I just doubt it will.
And I was talking to a friend of mine who's actually an entrepreneur, and he was saying to me that he thinks that what we're going to see is very much like the AIDS pandemic. There was a world before the AIDS pandemic, and then there's a world post-AIDS pandemic. Do you sort of buy into that worldview, Mike, that we're going to have a world which is pre-COVID and now post-COVID, where everything has been changed as a result of the experience that we've gone through? Or is it too early to say, do you think?
I from our last podcast, when I say that I think I said in the last podcast that the problem with predicting the future isn't that we don't have enough information today. It's that the future is unimaginable. And if I think we last spoke a year or so back, and in some ways that statement is yeah.
All right, Mike, you get the credit. All right, fine, well done. You were right. Well done.
It's another example of shit's coming, but you don't know what color it is, isn't it? But,
right.
And again, it applies again here. My instinct is things won't possibly change as much as people think. You have that kind of immediacy, that bias, don't you? That the things that happen to you today become far more significant and you imbue them with far more significance. I certainly think you would have got long odds on the thing that every single person in the world's talking about being a virus. It's a bit disappointing. If you'd have said to me, what is the one event that could stop the world and get every talking, I would have said a visiting alien, which would have been much more fun, as long as they were friendly aliens.
But that's a good point, actually. The fact that we can't imagine what is going to happen. But let's say you have a business. How would you deal with this particular situation? If you could give advice to the entrepreneurs out there, what would you do in order to limit the damage of this kind of event? Or is there anything that you can do?
Well, that's what I have. That's what I have been doing over the last few weeks, and it's very case specific, and the government, I think it's interesting, when Mr. Sunak turned up in his skinny tie and his nice suit, he really looked like he was going to deliver, didn't he? And then when you sort of scratch the surface of what he said, it got more and more complicated, and I think it's interesting, and I'd like to take that question in a slightly different direction. So I have been advising businesses specifically. We moved a business that has 130 odd stores in the UK. We managed to move a significant proportion of their sales online at a higher margin, which we think ultimately will save the business and will save somewhere in the region of 700 jobs. So it's a very specific piece of advice for that business, and that will be repeated. What can we do? How can we think differently? How can we think in the box? And that'll be very, very case specific. But I think the problem we've got at a macro level is what I would call the Goldman Sachs problem. So everybody who's involved in the delivery of this from the government is Goldman Sachs hedge fund. And they might as well be from another planet when it comes to entrepreneurially run businesses. When you get the train from Euston to Manchester for the Conservative conference, and you've worked at Goldman or you've worked at a hedge fund, and you're now a newly minted MP or a newly minted advisor, those industrial estates you go past on the way up, they're in another galaxy. They're on the outer rim. You've no experience of the stresses and strains. So why, this is again another question, why have we not got somebody from the small and medium-sized business arena involved in the delivery of help? Because while those of us who do give advice to businesses are able to look in the micro, there doesn't seem to be anybody with experience in this area advising the government on the macro. And this goes back to how we need to deliver the money and the way we can deliver the money. And I think that what they should have done, and if anyone listens to this with any influence, is a really easy and quick way and relatively fair way to help businesses now would have been to reverse last year's PAYE and NI contributions in business up to a certain size. So that would have been an immediate cash injection into every company in the UK. And it would have elements of fairness about it, because it would be pro rata. It would be on a per head basis. PAYE and NI businesses that employ more people would receive more support. And that would have been a really quick, easy way to helicopter money into businesses that most need it. without changing their debt profile, without changing their risk profile, without changing the way that they do business, and then to give them the cushion to then think about how can we deliver our service during this period, and how do we come out of this period. At the moment, we've got as I mentioned, this Kafkaesque labyrinthine trying to deliver a loan scheme through the banks asking for personal guarantees, above £250,000 they want a personal guarantee. All of these things are changing that covenant between entrepreneurs and the wider society. Is it because they don't understand the difference between the corporate world and the entrepreneurial world? So the corporate world, corporates are much more able to access aid, much more adapted to trading with a heavy leverage, heavy debt, whereas entrepreneurial people don't. That's not the way they do business. And yet we've got people who are from that corporate world, that Goldman Sachs world. I wonder if they just don't understand the dynamic, the difference in the dynamic between the two sectors. That is what it would appear, unless you, of course, you considered this as it's something that I think, I don't really tweet very often these days, but I think I tweeted right at the beginning of this that the measures that the Chancellor has enacted will represent the biggest transfer of business from small and mid-sized companies to corporates in history. And I still stand by that now. Unless they change the way they're going to deliver this aid, we will end up with, and this goes to what sort of world we will live in. We will live in a world with less companies.
And do you think that is a fundamental failure of the Conservative Party, the way they've done it?
I wonder if it's a bug or a feature.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
All puns intended.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Mike, one of the questions that somebody asked us when we were doing our last live stream, which is actually the question, if you remember, that we always ask at the end of our interviews, was what's the one thing that we're not talking about that we ought to be talking about? And my instinctive response was some of the winners and the positives out of this. Now, obviously, it sounds like one of the winners, in your opinion, will be the transnational corporations, which I would say is a negative outcome. But what do you see? Who are going to be some of the other people that do well out of this, and some of the positives that come out of this? Because no matter how bad a situation, there will always be people who do well out of it, and there will always be new industries, new creativity, new technology that comes out of it, new ways of doing things. Are we going to commute less? Are we going to pollute less? Are we, what are going to be some of the positives that you see coming out of this?
Well, I think we were headed in very quickly in the wrong direction as a species. I think Darwin said that that we need, it's the checks on our expansion that stop us using up all of our resources and becoming extinct. And I think in a way we had become too adapted or over adapted to our environment, which means that we were basically going to deplete all the resources until we were gone. I mean,
Mike, you haven't gone vegan on us, have you?
He's got his yoga mat behind there.
Well, I always look at things in terms of micro and macro, and in the macro, I don't think we were going in a very good direction. So you could almost say that any change, anything that causes us to pause in the direction that we're headed, has the potential to be good. And I think, I don't know, it's difficult because for most people now, they'll be very, very worried about, their jobs, about money and all of the things, and their families and the opportunities going forward. So I don't want to exaggerate the possibility for personal development from this, but I suspect that hopefully there's enough people, and I think that's the potential maybe for what you're looking for, is that people have had time to pause and think about what's important. That may be a forlorn hope, the human species. But that I guess that's the hope.
And Mike, can you see a time where actually, because we're going through this experience now, and it's making us reevaluate a lot of our lives, like things that you never questioned, we suddenly reevaluate, like commuting, going 40 minutes to a place and coming, and then going to an office and 40 minutes back. Running your own business, surely there's going to be a lot of people who are going to look and think to themselves, hang on, why am I paying for office space? This is a complete waste of money, when actually the vast majority of people can work remotely. They will be more effective, they'll be happier, and that means that I will save a whole ton of money.
Well, I think maybe it's a little bit even deeper than that. So I agree with you that people don't want to commute, and I think 40 minutes is a generous estimation of most people's, in and out of London, people are doing 2, 3, 4 hour commutes, and I think that's fundamentally destructive in so many ways. But I don't think people want to work at home either. I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm surviving here.
We all feel for you, Mike. Your life must be terrible.
But I think people would like to live in environments where they worked and where they lived were within walking distance. I think you sort of get under the skin of how we've designed our cities and designed our lives, and the basic architecture of the way we conduct ourselves, and that, I think, what it exposes, that isn't working. So it would be great, wouldn't it, as if you could, walk 15 or 20 minutes to your place of work, go home at lunchtime, leave work when you needed to do something urgent, go back to work. And that kind of dynamic, somewhere in the middle, if you like, of your the commute, but perhaps not. It's good to get. I don't think there's going to be something positive gained. I mean, somebody asked me the other day, what do you think the future looked like? And I was bastardizing the Orwell quote from 1984, and I said it's a laptop screen smashing you in the face forever. And I'm not sure that sitting in our offices glued to this screen is necessarily that healthy either. So somewhere in the middle, but I'm not quite sure how we get there.
No, because I'm sorry, Konstantin.
No, go ahead, mate. Go ahead.
No, because it just seems to me that this way that we're living, it doesn't seem sustainable. If you go back to the 9 to 5, and it didn't seem, looking back on it, that it was particularly effective either. But people had done it for generations, therefore we carried on. Surely the next generation of innovators and people coming out of it are going, well, we've actually managed to break that now. We've seen that it doesn't work. Therefore, let's try this new way.
Well, I think we'll definitely have. I think one of the economic effects of this situation will be the relative growth of the virtual over the real, if you like. So the virtual economy over the real economy. So you'll see more cloud-based activity, more remote activity, and certainly if you think about contingency planning for businesses now, where they used to have warehouses full of desks that everyone could go to, that's gone now, hasn't it? So there's going to be a whole different way of thinking about how you plan for this kind of emergency or this kind of business interruption going forward. So I think there will be changes. And people will work from home. Well, I'm just not sure we'll get to that fundamental change that is necessary, which is more holistic. It's the context of our lives. It is the big thing that I think this is even underlined even more is that technology is not saving you any time. It's not making you any happier. You are constantly available. I mean, the whole world's on shutdown, and yet everybody's cooped up in a room somewhere, talking into a Teams call. It's not improving our lives. It hasn't given us any more free time. So do we need a much more fundamental reset? I don't know.
Something more, another more fundamental virus to shut us down even more. That's what we need. Is what Mike is exactly what he's saying. But Mike, what is it that we're not seeing? What is it that we're not talking about? What do you, with a kind of totally different mindset to most people that I know, what is out of our field of vision that's coming?
Well, I think one of the consequences, I mean, I think people are talking about this, but that my biggest fear, and it's not my biggest fear for the economy or the country, maybe the biggest fear for the country, is the civil liberties implication of what will come after this. Rushing a vaccine through, that's a frightening prospect in many ways. Vaccinating many young people who don't necessarily need a vaccine is concerning. Thinking about how you're going to be monitored, how you're going to be tagged, how your movements are going to be big brothered. I think all of these things, I think, is it Jeremy Bentham and the concept of the people's behavior changed, the panopticon, if they're watched all the time, their behavior changes. And I think that's quite dynamic amongst populations as well. I think for some people, for many people, and it kind of goes back to the Huxley and the Brave New World view of where we are, is they may embrace that. They may embrace that sort of monitoring, that herding, to use the phrase in a different way. Well, there's many other people, and they're the people that affect change, who are going to find that intolerable. So it took breaking the law to change many of the things that we now take for granted, be it the suffragettes or homosexuality or many of those things. It took people who are prepared to step outside the boundaries. And similarly, the way most entrepreneurial people think is to be outside of the mainstream. And I think if we limit that, and I think that is perhaps the thing that worries me most, is we will limit the ability of those people who affect change to do so. And so where will that leave us in a very homogenous world? That's not a world I particularly want to live in.
Mike, well, let me push back on that a little bit, because as you know, if there was anyone who was concerned about the erosion of our civil liberties, restrictions of free speech, that's me. I've been pretty outspoken about this for a long time, but I've got to be honest with you. I look around. I mean, yes, in Australia, they're talking about some kind of app to track your immunity status. And that would be a hill that I'm prepared to die on. I'm not signing up to any fucking app that tracks me around the country. No way. But
if you can't travel, would you?
Right. But this is, yeah. I mean, yeah.
This is exactly my point. If someone said to you, your passport is dependent on you carrying your contact tracing app,
yeah,
then most of us would, and it erodes, doesn't it? So it starts with a contract tracing app. Where does it go after that?
Right. But my broader point, I mean, I take your point on that, and that is a step way too far in my opinion. But more broadly speaking, I do see the a lot of the people we've had on the show who we like and respect, kind of, in my opinion, going way off the deep end on this stuff and talking about how we're all under house arrest and all this stuff, which I think is a massive exaggeration. I think a temporary and necessary lockdown is not the same as house arrest. I personally don't feel like Western governments have been overly restrictive about this in proportion to the threat that we're facing. It is a warlike time. You accept a little bit more imposition on your freedoms during that time, provided they're time limited, provided they're specific, provided we can go back to, having a free society afterwards. Do you see signs that that's not going to happen? What's the reason for your concern?
I never trust people in power to give the keys back. Once they get, similar to the MMT conversation that we had earlier, once you give people in power and consider that their reasons for living or to obtain power, they really don't like giving it back. So while I might not be at the further end of the spectrum of the previous guests you've had, we as a country, as a species, have fought and lost millions of lives to maintain freedoms, and I don't think that should be lost. There are consequences. There's serious consequences to giving up the things that enable us to change. And I think that's what scares me most, is when you have a contact tracing app that you need to have, you've given the political order a lever with which to dictate or with which to demand your obedience. And anything that does that more, I think that would be very, very worrying. And you say you die on a hill for it, but the reality is most people won't. And then when most people won't, you'll be in the minority, and then your wife will want to take a nice holiday somewhere, and your kids will be saying, "Dad's an idiot. What difference does it make?" And compliance will become the norm, and that worries me.
I like the fact that we're talking about this, but for China, it's just business as normal, isn't it? I mean, that's basically what they do over there. So,
mate, just don't say stuff like that in your accent, please. It's just what they do over there, mate. Fucking hell. We're going to be banned off YouTube forever now. Mike, listen, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and your kind of counterintuitive ideas and a slightly different look at things is always brilliant. So we really appreciate you coming on. I would tell people to follow you on Twitter, but you don't tweet very much anymore.
They can still follow.
All right, so remind everybody your Twitter handle before we let you go.
Okay, I haven't been on for so long, I've completely forgotten it. What is my Twitter? @MDVex.
Yeah, @MDVex. So we'll make sure we get that right in the video description. Thanks for coming on, Mike. It's a pleasure as always, and we'll see the rest of you with another live stream tomorrow. Thanks for watching, guys. As always, subscribe to the YouTube channel, click the bell button next to the subscribe button so you get notified when a video comes out, and follow us on all the social media @TriggerPod.
And also leave us a nice review on iTunes and spread the word.